Pavlo Lakiichuk, military expert and head of the security program at the Center for Global Studies and Strategy 21st Century, is joining our broadcast. Pavel, hello, we're glad to see you. Let's talk about the explosion on the Ryazan-Moscow oil pipeline. They write that it has stopped supplies to the Russian capital itself. Well, the most interesting thing to understand here is this. We studied this number, 17% of refineries that have either been shut down or effectively destroyed over the past years of the Russian-Ukrainian war on Russian territory. So as you can see, where is this trend heading? If it reaches the interests of the Russian capital, could that change anything, or is it still not enough? Your assessment. It definitely changes things, and it is definitely not enough. The figure of 17%, well, if it wasn't just pulled out of thin air, then it was calculated using some rather rough methods. In fact, Russia had them at the beginning of 2024. The Ukrainian armed forces carried out a whole series of daring operations. At that time, we were forced to suspend this at the request, so to speak, of the American president. Oil prices will rise and so on, and other related things. That's why it's quite problematic to calculate exact figures right now. Obviously, those who did these calculations simply took the total number of plants, looked at the official data, and subtracted the plants that were affected. But that's also incorrect, because what does it mean for something to be out of commission? To what extent is it out of commission? What percentage of operational capacity has been lost? We can't say for sure how long this enterprise will be out of operation. Based on well-founded and thoroughly analyzed indicators, there is an extremely acute and pressing shortage of essential fuel and vital lubricants in the vast and geographically extensive Far East region, specifically in Sakhalin, Kamchatka, and the numerous Kuril Islands. That's entirely understandable because, among other significant factors, it involves an exceptionally long and complex logistical route. A severe shortage of critical materials, combined with the inherent challenges of relying heavily on the Trans-Siberian Railway, inevitably leads to a significant operational failure. Southern Russia, the Don Highway, Crimea, these regions. Here too there is a shortage, and a very acute one at that. If there is a shortage of fuel and lubricants in Crimea, that means there is also a shortage of fuel and lubricants for Russian troops in southern Ukraine. So obviously, and the Russians themselves openly admit that the fundamental root cause of the current shortage is precisely what they themselves call unscheduled, unexpected repairs at their various plants, which of course is the direct and undeniable result of our drones' persistent and effective work. We've now reached such a truly critical and pivotal point, a kind of profound catharsis, where the Russians are already, everything is incredibly neck and neck, just a tiny little bit less or just a tiny little bit more, and a significant shortage immediately arises, causing widespread issues. The answer then is quite simple and straightforward. We urgently need to continue our systematic and targeted strikes on Russian oil refining infrastructure so that it no longer brings substantial profit to the Russian Federation, to their defense industry enterprises, but instead becomes a truly problematic and burdensome asset for them. Instead of actively producing essential gasoline, diligently supplying the military's critical needs, comprehensively providing for the civilian sector's diverse requirements, or extensively exporting valuable resources, these crucial plants should be constantly and thoroughly undergoing necessary repairs, thereby significantly draining even more precious resources from the struggling Russian economy. Okay, let's move on. Steve Witkoff states that the Russians have made a peace proposal regarding the Donetsk region. Could you please explain what a peace proposal means according to the Russians and Steve Witkoff? Let me remind our audience that supposedly the idea was that the entire Donbas, meaning the administrative territories of the Donetsk region, should be handed over, and after that the war would stop. Do you believe in this? Please tell us. What is your opinion about this information? Well, as for Witkoff's point of view, I can't really explain his worldview. He wasn't able to explain it either to our own president or to our European partners. Let me remind you, after Witkoff returned from Moscow and said, the Russians are ready for a territorial exchange, the Europeans responded, let's have a video conference where Witkoff can explain to us what kind of compromise proposals the Russians have. So, after the first conference was organized, Witkoff tried to explain. No one understood. They organized a second conference. Witkoff tried to clarify. No one understood. At the third conference, Witkoff said, well, you see, this isn't a territorial exchange. It's the Ukrainians who have to cede Donbas to the Russians. A seemingly peaceful yet deeply contradictory proposal has emerged from the Russians, in which they, despite their ongoing actions, continue to act as the primary aggressor in the conflict. This stands in stark contrast to a genuine peace proposal from Ukraine, which is now being carefully considered and introduced into the international discourse, aiming to bring about a lasting and equitable resolution to the prolonged hostilities. Well, in general, no. Witkoff and his Russian Kremlin interlocutors, in my opinion, are signing for the wrong person, for whom they should have let Moscow be responsible for itself, for its proposals.
Yeah.
So, well, President Zelensky and the entire Ukrainian side have been unequivocally clear that the sovereign nation of Ukraine will absolutely not give up any of its internationally recognized territories, especially those currently occupied.
Okay.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Let's also talk about the current stage of the so-called Russian summer offensive. Julian Ropke, I understand that this Bild commentator often says things that, let's say, should be taken with a grain of skepticism. But nevertheless, he claims that the entire Russian summer offensive has completely failed. Tell us, do you agree with this assessment? Because, well, from what we're hearing, we're now in the second phase of the second wave. That is, after the first phase, where the Russians were quite openly thrown in as cannon fodder. Now the Russians are trying, with a second group, to secure positions in, let's say, breakthrough areas. Please give us your assessment.
Well, here Ropke is speaking precisely from the Russian perspective. Basically, he's saying the right things. Now, we're talking about phases, stages. That's not exactly military terminology. What is a strategic offensive operation? It's a set of coordinated actions in terms of forces, resources, location, timing, with the goal of seizing strategically important territories. It is carried out in several stages. The first objective of an offensive operation is to break through the enemy's defenses. After that comes the advance to engage reserves, second echelons in the operational space, and the achievement of the main objectives. As a result, after the second objective of a strategic offensive operation, the armed forces either switch to a defensive operation, that is, they go on the defensive, or the next offensive operation begins. From a strategic and meticulously planned point of view, Putin's generals precisely calculated the extensive forces and resources required so that within 2 or 3 crucial weeks, they would be able to break through the formidable Ukrainian defenses at the primary points of attack, subsequently exploit this significant breach, and then advance in a swift and decisive march, just as they did in the year 2022. That would be a successful strategic offensive operation. Were the Russians able to break through the Ukrainian defenses? No, they were not. For 4, even 5 months now, at the very least, if we call this the strategic operation Ozma, they have been banging their heads against the Ukrainian defenses. Yes, they are advancing, they are pushing through the Ukrainian defenses, but those defenses are not collapsing. There is no breakdown in command and control. The defense isn't falling apart like dominoes, and they haven't managed to bring in a second echelon to break out into the operational depths, to advance, figuratively speaking, toward Dnipropetrovsk. That's the situation. Everything comes down to tactical actions. Moreover, the schedule of operations is being disrupted, both in terms of resources and manpower, as well as material supplies. The resources that were prepared to exploit success, those meant for breaking through the defense, have already been used. Now the next ones have to be used. They are being thrown in to continue forcing this breach. The second echelons, which were intended to break out into the operational space, are also being committed to replace or reinforce the depleted units that were supposed to break through the defense. This has been going on for 4 months. Eventually, the critical moment truly comes when, yes, the formidable defense is finally breached. Roughly speaking, the strategically important city of Pokrovsk has been utterly and completely destroyed. It's time to break out into the operational space. But there are neither human nor material resources left, because the resources that were allocated for the offensive have already been spent. A new comprehensive strategic operation needs to be carefully planned. This will involve a thorough regrouping of forces. And it's not exactly a successful one, to put it mildly. Therefore, despite the fact that they really do have the initiative, and indeed they are pushing through our defenses in many areas, moreover in the Pokrovsk direction, in the Konstantinovka area, and especially in Toretsk, essentially in the rear of the Toretsk direction, in the Novopavlovsk direction, in the Levansk direction, the Russians continue to press, they keep pushing through. but the operation plan went out the window. So the operation is unsuccessful, therefore Rupka is right in his own way.
Pavel, I want to clarify something with you because I think it's a fundamentally important point since, well, it's clear that society is tired of the war, that's obvious. There's really no secret about that for anyone. But we need to understand, why does Putin want Donbas specifically? From what I can gather as a journalist, Putin understands that, essentially, Sloviansk and Kramatorsk are two huge urban agglomerations that have been held by Russian forces since 2014. It was in Sloviansk that the first battles began with Strelkov's Gherkin's gang. So it's not just symbolic significance, but it's also a fortress. After that, if Putin actually gets this without a fight, he will be able to easily advance on other cities. Could you please explain how far this is from the truth and what nuances the audience should know in order to understand, from a military political perspective, Putin's specific claims to these cities?
It's not merely a claim, it's a truly cunning maneuver. Vladimir Putin is indeed very cunning. Yes, that is absolutely correct. The crucial thing to understand is that ever since the year 2014 and continuing into 2015, as the intense fighting and the active hostilities in the specific Donetsk direction and along the entire perimeter of both the LNR and the DNR gradually subsided, a very robust and sophisticated system of defense was meticulously being constructed there, a deeply layered and highly effective system of Ukrainian defense, specifically within the broader Donetsk region. The other day, I was rewatching some of the most prominent Russian propaganda channels from the very first week of the unprovoked and full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There was a lot of interesting nonsense from the Russian propagandists, including statements like, "What are our forces doing? It's now the 4th or 5th day of the invasion, the 28th or the 1st of March. In Donbas, our forces are encircling, surrounding a 100,000 strong Ukrainian group that is positioned along our border. Now they're going to be surrounded, and that's the end for the Ukrainian army. That's the crux of the problem. Donbas has been turned into a living people's defensive system. Neither in the south, nor in the Kharkiv direction, nor in the Sumy direction, nor in Kherson is there such a powerful, extensive, and incredibly robust system of defensive fortifications, so exceptionally well-developed and densely inhabited as is found in the strategically vital Donbas region. In actual fact, what Vladimir Putin is proposing to do is to hand over to Ukraine its very own, historically significant and formidable Mannerheim line. Isn't that right? Ukraine is giving up its Mannerheim line. And after that, we'll handle things ourselves. That's Putin's idea, from a military point of view.
So this is exactly what distinguishes Donbas from the two other regions that are also written into the so-called Russian constitution, right? That is Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts. This is the key difference, if we can sum it up.
Absolutely right. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, the line of fortifications was only created after 2022.
I see now.
Several years. The extensive fortifications and formidable defensive line in the Donbas region have been in existence for approximately a full decade now. They are well developed, calculated, and zeroed in.
Thank you. Pavlo Lakiichuk, military observer, was on air with Ukraine Today. Thank you so much. Goodbye.